good afternoon, good evening. Not sure exactly what the hour is where you are in California. I'm speaking to you here virtually from my office in New York due to various circumstances, but I'm delighted to be able to offer these closing remarks to your conference. First of all, thanks very, very much to both Richard and Jennifer, outgoing and incoming presidents of the organization, Southern California Mediation Association, for the honor that you gave me at the outset of the conference and for this opportunity to offer some remarks now at the closing. So I have a question for myself, which is what can I really offer you as a takeaway from your conference as an outsider, in the sense that I haven't been there watching and listening the whole time, and also as an academic and a researcher, which that's really been my profession and role for the last 40 plus years, rather than a practitioner, and that's probably what most of you are. So what can I offer you? I have two insights that I hope will be meaningful to share with you from my own work. They're distinct from one another, they're related to each other, and I think they'll be relevant to you and to the subject of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the mediation field. That has been the theme of the conference. So let me share these with you. Number one, based on my work over these last 40 years, for many people, mediation has been seen as what you might call a gated community, a gated field, by people of color and others. I was lucky to be a member of the research team that led something that we called the Barriers Study about a little over a decade ago. I think it's the only study that's ever been done of its kind. I may be wrong, but I think it is, which was designed and conducted by an interracial, interethnic team of investigators. We interviewed about 6 people of color and others underrepresented in the mediation provider community, primarily in the New York area. We spent hundreds of hours talking to these folks, and based upon the comments that they made, we identified a number of themes that indicated what they saw as barriers that were presented to people like themselves for entry, advancement in the mediation field, and success in the mediation field. So the result of that study, the barriers that they identified, were both eye-opening and challenging, and are kind of captured in this expression, a gated field, which was used by many of them. How is mediation a gated field? What has made entry and advancement and success in the field difficult for people of color and others who are underrepresented as providers of the service that we offer? So let me mention some of the main findings of that project, some of the main barriers that were identified. Number one, the required credentials to get into and advance in the field. Credentials like professional qualifications and degrees and certificates, other kinds of qualifications in terms of experience and years in practice of a certain kind, and training, and hours of training, and kinds of training. And all of those credentials over the years have been raised higher and higher and higher. And for many people, those credentials themselves present a barrier to entry. That's true in many fields, and it's true in ours as well. Second barrier, which is very widespread in our field, is the pro bono entry requirement, as they called it. In other words, to really begin to serve as a mediator for many agencies, you have to start out by agreeing to serve for a number of hours as a pro bono volunteer mediator, either on your own or with someone else. That pro bono entry requirement turns out to be a barrier for many people, as I will talk about in a minute. But it means you have to serve for numbers of hours, numbers of cases, without any compensation. And that's a barrier for many people. Number three, limited access to opportunities for actual compensated and paid work. Membership on a roster, listing on a roster of a court or of another kind of agency, attendance at conferences with often high attendance and registration fees, you get the message that what's involved in a lot of these barriers is an economic barrier that makes it quite difficult for people who don't have necessarily a large bank account. I don't mean a bank account, but a large access to economic resources to fund the training, the credentials, the conference fees, the roster requirements. All of these are barriers to entry to the field. And finally, not least important, there are a lot of gatekeepers in the field. People who actually administer programs, people who limit access to rosters, people that you have to know in order to advance in the field. And of course, that's true in every field. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And the mediation field, getting to know the people it's important to know is not easy, especially not easy for people who don't have the right network to begin with, who aren't part of that network to begin with. So all of these barriers contribute to what are significant economic costs of entry and participation, and they contribute to the affordability of actually becoming a mediator and continuing and succeeding as a mediator, both in terms of requirements that are simply financial requirements and also requirements that are voluntary time contributions. And all of these together form a pretty substantial barrier and bar to getting into, participating in, and succeeding in the mediation field. This is what our study participants told us over and over again in many different ways. So that's a pretty big challenge. How do we lower that bar? How do we meet this challenge? How do we open the gate to the field? That's what our study wanted to find out. We didn't find out how to actually open the gate. We found out what caused the gate, what the gate was consisting of. The challenge of lowering the barriers, opening the gate, is a different matter. In that regard, I want to point to a different sort of insight and aspect of my work over these last 4 decades as a student, as someone who studies and researches and writes about the mediation field. And over those 40 years, the focus of my work has been on the value of self-determination, party self-determination, that lies at the center of the mediation process and the mediation field. At least that is our rhetoric, that is our claim. But the fact is, as I've suggested in my work for quite a few years now, that value, the value of preserving and enhancing party self-determination as a unique feature and value of the mediation process, has really, in a certain sense, gone missing in action. That value has been diluted over the years by the very kinds of things that I mentioned that we discovered in the barrier study. That is, an increasing emphasis in mediation practice on mediator expertise, and especially substantive expertise and substantive knowledge. So that if the mediator is working in the disability field, the mediator has to have expertise about the law of disability, ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, knowledge of the law, knowledge of the regulation, knowledge even of court decisions is a requirement for being on a panel of ADA mediators. In the family field, in a state like Florida, which together with California was one of the leading states in developing the field of family mediation, and especially court-connected family mediation, the requirement for membership on a family mediation panel is extraordinary in terms of knowledge of family law, knowledge of family systems in the mental health field, knowledge of pension law. All of these things are things the mediator is supposed to be an expert on in order to be qualified to practice mediation. Expertise, of course, of any of these kinds requires qualifications, whether it's a credential, a degree, a substantial amount of study, even graduate study, and a substantial amount of training in all of these specific substantive areas. So those are exactly the kinds of things that create barriers for people to come into the field and meet those qualifications and meet those requirements, and that pose substantial financial and time barriers to participating in the field. It's interesting. Many years ago, when I did another research project on ethical dilemmas that some of you may have been familiar with, I think one of the first research projects on ethical dilemmas in mediation in 1987, I interviewed over 100 mediators all across the state of Florida. And in the process, I discovered and I interviewed a woman who was known in Florida as the mother of family mediation in Florida. Unfortunately, the mother of family mediation in Florida was no longer qualified to practice family mediation because of the requirements that had since been imposed of training, background, degrees, expertise. But she was the one who began the whole thing. So, what is my suggestion here in terms of how to lower the barriers that I spoke about at the beginning of these comments? My suggestion is that we do what we call these days in the computer age, a reset of our mediation requirements and our mediation field's focus, to go back to a focus on self-determination, party self-determination, and the process skills that mediators can use to support and not supplant party self-determination. Those skills basically are communication skills and interaction skills. That's what we need as mediators to have expertise and training in, not the substantive law involved in a particular area, the law or the financial aspects or the pension regulations or the mental health dimensions. These are all substantive areas of expertise, but they're not and should not be required as requisites for the practice of mediation. We have to get back to the basics. The basics of mediation are the skills that are involved in helping people talk to each other, communicate with each other, think through decisions, and make decisions that they believe are good for themselves. Those skills are skills that don't require extraordinary time and expense of training, qualifications, and certifications. We need to get back to the basics. That is what will let people into the now gated world of mediation. It will let people of color in. It will let other people in. It will let lay people in. And I know you've had panels on co-mediation by lay people and professionals. I think that's the way that we can begin to lower the barriers that I believe still exist. Even though the barrier study was done over a decade ago, I don't think those barriers had been eliminated. I'm not even sure that they've been lowered to a tremendous degree, but there is a way to lower them. And I think it involves resetting our aspirations as a field away from substantive expertise and back to the skills of helping people to communicate with each other and make decisions for themselves. We also have to, one final note, I think we also have to directly try to make participation in mediation more affordable and more viable economically to a larger share of the world, a larger portion of the world, especially people of color. We have to do some very specific things. For example, I think we have to, as practitioners, hire other people to work with us. We have to share fees with people who would not be able to start a practice on their own, and we have to therefore give them the opportunity to get initial practice experience without having to contribute many, many pro bono hours that they simply can't afford to contribute when they have other economic demands in their lives. We have to subsidize training. We have to subsidize training. We have to offer free training. Training is an enormous expense. Training fees are substantial. But in fact, we can, those of us who have succeeded in the mediation field, we can afford to offer free training to people who need it in the mediation field. My institute has done that. I have done that. And I think it's a way of paying back the experience that we've gotten in the mediation field. I'll say more about that in 1 minute. I think we have to adopt different formats in training that make it possible for people to participate in training without having to take large amounts of time away from paid work that they do to sustain themselves economically. Mediation training originally was always done in blocks of time, whether it was a weekend or 5 days in a row, 30 hours of training, 40 hours of training. That, especially in today's age of internet and Zoom communication, like the way we're communicating now, can be reformatted to make it possible for people to participate much more viably even without taking away from their economic base of their paid employment. So in a certain way, what I'm saying is this, this field began, I'm at least in the non-labor area, 40 or 50 years ago. I'm old enough to remember that era, and the folks that started me off, people like Randy Lowry, people like my colleague and mentor Josh Stolberg, that many of you may know back here in the East. And in those days, much of the opportunity for entry and advancement in the field came by being a volunteer mediator in a community mediation program. I ran such a program in San Francisco in 1976 for 2 years. I ran such a program in connection with the Queens Mediation Center at Hofstra in the mid-1980s, where we actually mediated community disputes, and that's how people got started as mediators. If people would ask me, what's the path to becoming a professional mediator? I would say, well, the broadest path is to volunteer as a mediator in one of the hundreds of mediation centers, community mediation centers all over the country. I'm sure that many of you, I would guess, began your career that way. Those community mediation centers often were provided and fed with cases by communities which were made up of regular folks, many people of color. And their disputes gave us the wherewithal to gain the experience that we needed to become professional mediators. I think they gave us a lot, those folks from the neighborhood, gave us a tremendous amount of opportunity for developing our professional expertise. I think one way to lower the barriers that exist to many of those folks becoming our colleagues in the field is for us to give back to that community, those people, the benefit of opportunities to work with us, to share fees with us, to get trained by us without having to sacrifice their economic viability. So that's a suggestion for the future. I suppose that's entering on perhaps a controversial note, but what are closing remarks for, if not to start more controversy? So I hope that I've given you some food for thought that fits with the content of the work that you've done over the last 24 hours, and I appreciate very much the chance to share these thoughts with you. And I'm always open to communicating with anybody about anything I've said here. You can reach me by email at Hofstra Law School. You can Google me and you'll find out my email. I can tell you it's lawrab, Lawrab at hofstra.edu. Please send me your thoughts about all of this if you wish, and let's start a conversation. Thank you so much, and good night.